Joining us now to discuss the outcome of this weekend's referendum in Zimbabwe are Dipros Muchena. He's the Deputy Director of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, and in Cape Town, Webster Zambara, who's the Senior Project Leader for the Southern Africa Desk at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, also joins us. Let me say good evening and welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us here on Beyond Markets. Dipros, let me start with you. Largely peaceful, a very clear yes vote. What is the sense that you're getting? Are we moving straight ahead to the election as set down in the roadmap, or are we likely to have hiccups?
Well, one hopes that we are going to move down the road of elections as drawn up by the Southern African Development Community. You know that this constitutional draft and its referendum was an important marker. I think the challenge now between now and the next date of elections is whether the preparations, the environment, and the preparedness of the country stands to the test of what a democratic election must be conducted like.
Webster, let me bring you in here and take up the point that Dipros made, whether the processes hold up to give us a fair and transparent election. We have seen instances where senior people in the MDC were harassed, were arrested. Substantively though, do they mar what happened over the weekend, or do you think that we are set to go forward in what people would be able to term a transparent and a free and a leveling playing field in terms of the elections coming up?
Thank you for having me. I think this development does not put the country in a good light, considering that the Sadc monitoring team for the referendum is still in the country, and we already have issues of these arrests targeting the Prime Minister's office. But it's not for me to comment on that for now. However, more worrying is that their lawyer, Beatrice Mtetwa, was also arrested, and her legal team managed to get a High Court order to release her. This High Court order has been ignored, and up to until afternoon, as far as I have heard, has been ignored by the police. And this again does not put the country in a good light, because it brings into perspective the issue of the rule of law. And in no certain terms that in a normal working country, you have a High Court order being ignored by the police arbitrarily.
Dipros, the role of the police was of course the subject of much discussion as we worked our way up to the referendum. Considering the conduct of the police over the weekend, are we supposed to be optimistic, or do we think that the police is going to be emboldened, given the fact that they could pull off these arrests and there's a sense that things move forward? Do you think this will embolden them to act more partisanly, or do you think that enough checks and balances are in place to make sure that the repeat of what happened over the weekend doesn't happen again?
Well, currently there are no enough checks and balances to stop the police from deploying arresting powers in a selective manner. One of the ghosts that have always plagued Zimbabwe since 2000 has been the selective application of the rule of law and selective arrests, selective prosecution, and in fact selective persecution in the name of prosecution. I don't think that there is anything deterring the police at the present moment from acting the way they are doing. Unless if you adopt the current constitution and begin to act in terms of its spirit, then there are going to be accountability measures taken on people who are illegally acting, abusing the law to achieve political ends. But at the present moment, there is nothing that's stopping them. I mean, there is a president who is a principal to the GPA. There are government ministers who are tied together in the GPA. Sadc is there. The world is looking at Zimbabwe at the present moment. Acting in this manner just attracts unnecessary negative attention on the country.
Webster, of course, the process is far from perfect, but substantively speaking, a lot better than the last process that we have had. Is it sufficient, though, to be the building blocks of what is required to have an election whose integrity cannot be called into question, the outcome of which should not be gainsaid by any of the parties?
Certainly a very important building block, no doubt about it. We are not in the same situation like we were 4 or 5 years ago. But then the issue is, are we working to bring this issue, this contestation, into a logical conclusion? Particularly, it brings in the role of Sadc as the midwife to this process, whether it is going to be seized by the events in Zimbabwe, but especially as we go towards a contestation of an election that we are going to have. The referendum has been okay because both all the main parties, particularly MDCT and ZANU-PF, have been agreeing that we are going to vote yes. But it now ends here. From now on, the eye is now on the election, and we know that in an election, particularly the first past the post system that we have, where the winner will grab all, it's going back to a serious contestation in which, in my opinion, we could have ended, we could have seen the death of working together now, the death of this unity government. We are just waiting for the funeral that we are going to see at the election time. And that brings into question the role of Sadc, particularly that they are at the brink of a successful mediation process or a failed mediation process at the last minute, which unfortunately is not in the best interest of Zimbabwe, is not in the best interest of Sadc, and is also not in the best interest of humanity, that Zimbabwe, with all its potentials, would be a failed state. And I want to believe that Sadc will be seized by the events in Zimbabwe to see that the processes are seen through.
Deepros, do you believe that Sadc has done enough to be not just any midwife, but the most capable of delivering this process, bearing in mind, of course, that the position has always been that it's the people of Zimbabwe that will determine that country's future, and that Sadc's role is a role of an enabling agent to ensure that the conditions prevail, that Zimbabweans can determine their own future?
Well, I think Sadc has done what Sadc can do. And it has resolved this matter in a Sadc way. I think there are certain things that they are not going to say or do. They are not going to be aggressive. They are going to use...
Ought they to be, though?
I think they ought to be. These days, processes of global development are affected by regions. The state of a regional bloc determines whether investment comes to the region, not just to the country. So it's in the interest of Sadc to see a viable region. And a viable region is set up on the best democratic experiment that you can have. And therefore, I think Sadc needs to say a little more, in particular if they think that their roadmap is now under danger or under attack by some of the forces that may not want progress in the country, because there are forces that progress when retrogression is taking place. Sadc ought to step in, talk to political leaders, and ensure that the country continues to be on a roadmap. I think at the present moment, the challenge now is to ensure that the Constitution is now in place. We need to make sure that all laws that are in existence comply with the Constitution. Subsidiary legislation, the Public Order and Security Act, the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and other laws, including electoral laws, need to comply now with the Constitution. Then you want to clear the roadmap or the field of playing elections to ensure that the media is accessible by all parties that are going to contest in this election, and civil society can participate in terms of its role in promoting democracy. Sadc must have a stake in ensuring that these things happen, or else we have a failed experiment.
Webster, the question of the participation of Zimbabweans and the role of civil society, some observers have suggested that the turnout for the referendum, whilst it's an overwhelming yes, is rather low, and that you don't have the kind of appetite that people would have liked to see among Zimbabweans for this process. Is that something that you agree with? Do you think that Zimbabweans are not, did not come up in the kind of numbers that they ought to have been to kickstart this process?
Certainly, I think having a turnout of about 30% or slightly below 30% is a bit deplorable for such an important exercise as the constitution making process, which is a process that has been going on for the past 15 or so years.
Let me interrupt you, Webster. Webster, let me just go back to the question of the fact that it's deplorable. What is that an indication of? Is that an indication of fatigue on the part of the Zimbabwean population, or an inability of the key role players to explain the importance and the centrality of this referendum and the importance of ushering in this new constitution as the basis on which to go forward?
I think there are a number of issues that could have played out there. One of them being the short period and lack of time to debate the contents of the constitution, and another one being that the main contenders are both agreeing that we are going to vote yes. And that scenario sometimes gives people an impression that not much is going to happen anyway, because we are all agreeing, so a vote yes was almost as good as a done deal. If they were opposing political viewpoints, and if any of the major political parties was saying no and one is saying yes, we could have seen a different scenario. But what I want to bring out is perhaps a comparison with the Kenyan process, where 72% of the people came and voted in the Kenyan referendum process, which is far way above what we saw in Zimbabwe, and which gives an indication that the process had lured people to participate.
Now, Deepros, what are the main reasons why Zimbabweans didn't come out in the kinds of numbers that one would have expected? 30% is very low. And there's been several reasons cited. There was the lack of money. Tendai Biti was very upfront that there wasn't enough resources. There's the lack of time. And then, of course, that there wasn't a contentious issue. There wasn't a yes or a no. The big players all want this process, want to get into an election so that the government of national unity can cease to exist and you have an outright winner one way or the other.
Well, I think all of the reasons that you cite contributed to the low turnout. But I think that there is a sense in which most Zimbabweans are really looking beyond the referendum. The real contest in Zimbabwe is going to be the national elections. The real contest is going to be when the election date is actually set. So the referendum was a ceremonial process on the road to elections. And the fact that political parties had agreed that we should all vote yes and mobilize their base to vote yes indicated to me that people then decided, well, there was no contest. But also I think the concern for me is for political parties. If they were unable to mobilize their members to come out in numbers to vote for the constitution, either they are incapable of mobilizing their members, or in fact they have no members. That ordinary citizens belong to various other opinions and affiliations. And so I think all the reasons that you cite are behind the referendum itself, but the major reason is that people are tired. They want peace in Zimbabwe, they want progress, and they want to vote in the national elections.
Webster, we've got a minute left. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Your prospects for the process going forward. Do you think that political parties are going to up the ante and things are going to become a little bit more tense, given the fact that, the kind of ceremonial process, if you like, is done, and it's now the real deal that has to be fought over?
Certainly we are entering the period of real contestation, and things are going to heat up as we go to the election. And like I said before, this is the best time for Sadc to be involved, particularly the calls for long-term monitors, so that this process comes to a logical conclusion with an election that is acceptable, that is free, and that is fair, guided by its own Sadc principles and guidelines in the conduct of elections.